The morning mist hung low over Arlington National Cemetery as Sergeant Michael Rodriguez prepared for what would become the most important day of his military career. At 26 years old, he had spent 3 years as a tomb guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier, one of the most prestigious and demanding assignments in the United States Army. The sacred duty required absolute perfection, unwavering dedication, and complete adherence to protocol that had remained unchanged for decades. Michael came from a long line of military service members. His grandfather had served in Vietnam, his father in the Gulf War, and his older brother was currently deployed overseas. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Michael had always known he would serve his country. But becoming a tomb guard exceeded even his highest aspirations. The selection process was grueling. It's only a tiny percentage of applicants earning the right to guard America's most sacred military site. The tomb of the unknown soldier represents every service member who died in battle, but whose remains were never identified or recovered. 3 unknown soldiers from World War I, World War II, and the Korean War rest beneath the white marble monument. For Michael and his fellow guards, protecting this site was not just a job, it was a sacred honor and a solemn promise too. The families who never got to bury their loved ones. Every movement Michael made during his guard duty was precisely choreographed. 21 steps south along the black mat. Turn and face east for exactly 21 seconds. Then 21 steps north. Turn and face west for 21 seconds. The number 21 represented the highest military honor, a 21-gun salute. Even in the depths of winter or the heat of summer, through snow, rain, and wind, the guard never ceased. The tomb had been watched continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, since 1937. Michael's uniform was immaculate. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his brass buttons gleamed, and every crease in his clothing was razor sharp. The rifle he carried was a ceremonial M14, maintained in perfect condition and inspected daily. His movements were so precise that visitors often wondered if he was human or some kind of mechanical figure. The training to become a tomb guard was intense and unforgiving. Michael had spent months memorizing the history of the cemetery, learning the names and details of notable figures buried there, and practicing his movements until they became as natural as breathing. He could recite the guard's creed from memory. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter, wherein with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Particular morning in late October, dark clouds gathered overhead, promising a significant storm. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain and strong winds throughout the day. Michael had guarded the tomb through many storms before. Rain, snow, sleet, and blazing heat were all part of the job. The unknown soldiers had endured far worse conditions in battle. The guards considered it their honor to endure any weather while standing watch. As Michael took his position for the morning shift, he noticed a group of veterans gathered nearby for a wreath-laying ceremony. Among them was an elderly man in a wheelchair, wearing a Vietnam War veteran cap and a worn military jacket covered with patches and medals. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with weathered hands and eyes that held the weight of memories from long ago. The veteran's name was Frank Martinez, though Michael did not know this yet. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine infantryman. He had lost many friends in combat and carried survivor's guilt that had haunted him for 50 years. After returning from war, Frank had struggled with what was then called shell shock and is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had spent decades trying to make peace with his experiences and honor the memory of the brothers he had lost. Frank had traveled from California to visit Arlington for the first time since the war. His son had driven him across the country because Frank finally felt ready to face the memories and pay his respects to fallen comrades. This visit represented years of therapy, healing, and gathering the courage to confront the grief he had carried alone for so long. As the morning progressed, the storm clouds grew darker and more threatening. Wind began to pick up, rustling through the autumn leaves that covered the cemetery grounds. Michael continued his measured pace. 21 steps south, turn. 21 steps north, turn, never varying by even an inch. His movements remained precise, despite the increasing wind that tugged at his uniform and threatened to disturb his perfect posture. The veteran's ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon. Just as the weather was expected to turn severe, Frank sat in his wheelchair near the tomb, staring at the inscription that read, "Here rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God." Tears gathered in his eyes as he thought about his friends who had never made it home, whose families never knew what happened to them in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Other visitors began to seek shelter as the first drops of rain started to fall, but Frank remained motionless in his wheelchair. His son approached him several times, suggesting they wait in the visitor center until the storm passed, but Frank shook his head. He had waited 50 years for this moment, and no amount of rain would drive him away from paying his respects to the unknown soldiers, who represented all the fallen heroes he had known and loved. Michael noticed Frank's determination and felt a deep respect for the veteran's dedication. As a tomb guard, Michael encountered many visitors who were deeply moved by the sight. But there was something special about Frank's quiet vigil. The old Marine sat perfectly still, his own form of standing at attention, despite the approaching storm that would soon test everyone's resolve. At exactly noon, the sky opened up with a fury that surprised even the meteorologists who had predicted the storm. Rain came down in sheets, driven by winds that howled through the cemetery like banshees. Within minutes, the carefully manicured grounds became saturated. Water began pooling on the pathways around the tomb. Most visitors fled immediately, seeking shelter in the nearby visitor center or running to their cars in the parking lot. Tour groups huddled under covered areas, and even the most dedicated tourists decided to wait out the storm. But Frank Martinez remained in his wheelchair near the tomb, his Vietnam veteran cap pulled low over his eyes, rain streaming down his weathered face. Michael continued his ceremonial walk, his polished shoes now splashing through puddles that formed on the black mat. His red uniform coat became heavy with water, and his white gloves were soaked through. The rain struck his face like tiny needles, but he maintained his precise pace and perfect posture. This was what he had trained for to guard the tomb. Regardless of conditions, the storm intensified with each passing minute. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, followed by thunder that rumbled through the ground beneath their feet. The rain fell so heavily that visibility dropped to just a few yards. Palace guards throughout history had maintained their posts through wars, natural disasters, and every kind of weather, and Michael was determined to uphold that tradition. But as Michael completed another circuit of his 21 steps, he noticed something alarming. Frank had not moved from his wheelchair despite being completely exposed to the storm. The elderly veteran was soaked to the bone, his thin jacket providing no protection against the driving rain. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair, and his body shook, whether from cold, emotion, or both. Michael could not tell. Frank's son had taken shelter under a nearby tree and was calling out to his father, begging him to come in from the storm, but Frank either could not hear him over the wind and rain or was choosing not to respond. The old Marine sat transfixed, staring at the tomb through the downpour, as if in a trance brought on by memories and grief that had been bottled. Up for 50 years? Michael's training screamed at him to maintain his post. Tomb guards had walked their beats through hurricanes, blizzards, and scorching heat waves. The vigil had never been broken, not once in over 80 years. The unknown soldiers below had endured far worse conditions in battle, and it was the guards' duty to match their sacrifice with unwavering dedication. Yet as Michael watched Frank sitting motionless in the punishing rain, something deeper than training began to stir within him. This was not just any visitor seeking a photo opportunity or a brief moment of tourism. This was a combat veteran, a brother in arms, whose presence at the tomb clearly meant everything to him. Frank's determination to remain despite the storm showed a level of respect and dedication that Michael recognized and honored. The rain continued to pound down with biblical intensity. Michael's uniform was now completely soaked, water running from the brim of his cap and pooling in his boots. His rifle, though covered with a protective sheath, was being battered by the storm. Every instinct told him to continue his measured walk, to maintain the perfect discipline that defined the tomb guard. But Frank was beginning to look dangerously frail. His son had moved closer, clearly terrified that his elderly father would become ill or worse from exposure to the storm. Other family members who had come for the ceremony huddled nearby, torn between respecting Frank's wishes and protecting his health. The veteran's lips had taken on a bluish tint, and his shaking had become more pronounced. Michael completed another circuit, his boots splashing through water that was now ankle-deep in some spots. Lightning crashed overhead, illuminating the scene in stark, dramatic flashes. The cemetery had taken on an otherworldly appearance, sheets of rain creating curtains between the headstones and monuments. As Michael turned to begin another 21 steps south, he found himself facing a moment that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The regulations were crystal clear: maintain the guard at all costs. But looking at Frank, seeing a fellow veteran in potential danger, Michael felt the pull of a higher duty. The storm raged around them, nature itself seeming to test the resolve of everyone present. In the distance, Frank's family called out desperately, their voices barely audible over the wind and thunder. Other visitors who had remained under shelter watched the scene unfold, some taking photos and videos despite the conditions. Michael took his next step, and another, maintaining perfect form even as the storm tried to knock him off balance. But with each step, his eyes remained fixed on Frank, on this brave veteran who refused to leave his post, just as surely as Michael refused to leave his own. Two soldiers, separated by decades in different wars, but united in their dedication to honoring the fallen. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. Frank's condition was clearly deteriorating, and Michael knew that soon he would have to choose between following orders and following his conscience. The unknown soldiers beneath the marble had died serving others, and Michael wondered what they would want him to do in this moment, when duty and compassion seemed to conflict. The decision came suddenly, triggered by a moment that would replay in Michael's mind for years to come. As he completed his turn and faced west, lightning illuminated the scene with brilliant white light. In that instant, he saw Frank slump forward in his wheelchair, his body going limp as if the strength had finally left him. The elderly veteran's cap fell from his head and was immediately swept away by the rushing water, without hesitation. Michael broke from his ceremonial walk. His polished shoes splashed through the deepening puddles as he moved quickly but carefully toward Frank's wheelchair. The watching family members gasped in surprise and relief as they saw the tomb guard abandoning his post to help their patriarch. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, his voice gentle but urgent as he knelt beside Frank's wheelchair. Up close, he could see that the veteran was conscious but severely chilled and disoriented. Frank's skin was pale and cold to the touch, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Frank looked up at Michael with confused but grateful eyes. I couldn't leave," he whispered through chattering teeth. "They're all here, my brothers. I promised I would come. ... Michael understood immediately. He had met many veterans over his years at the tomb, and he recognized the signs of someone processing deep trauma and survivor's guilt. Frank was not just enduring the storm out of stubbornness. He was fulfilling a promise made decades ago to fallen comrades, a promise that meant more to him than his own comfort or safety. "I understand, sir," Michael said softly. "And they know you came. They know you kept your promise. But they wouldn't want you to suffer because of it." Frank's son rushed over, having finally decided to brave the storm himself. "Dad, please, we need to get you inside. You're going to make yourself sick." But Frank shook his head weakly. "Not yet. Ceremony. ... I need to lay the wreath." Michael looked at the wreath that Frank's family had brought, now partially damaged by the storm but still intact. He made another decision that would shock everyone present. "Sir, would you allow me to help you lay the wreath? We can do it together, and then I can escort you to shelter." The offer was unprecedented. Tomb guards did not participate in civilian ceremonies. They maintained their watch from a respectful distance, never interfering with or joining official proceedings. But Michael could see that Frank was fighting a battle between his physical limitations and his emotional needs. And he knew that sometimes rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. Frank's eyes filled with tears that mixed with the rainwater on his face. "You would do that?" "It's your duty." "My duty is to honor the fallen and serve those who served," Michael replied. "Right now, that means making sure you can complete your mission safely." Working together, Michael helped Frank retrieve the wreath from where his family had sheltered it. The arrangement was beautiful, despite the storm damage: red, white, and blue flowers arranged around a banner that read, "For my brothers who never came home." Frank's hands shook as he held it, but his grip was determined. Michael positioned himself behind Frank's wheelchair and began pushing it slowly toward the tomb. The other family members followed, creating a small procession through the driving rain. Tourists and visitors who had remained under shelter watched in amazement as this unprecedented scene unfolded before them. The wind howled around them, and the rain seemed to fall even harder as they approached the marble monument. Michael had to lean into the wind to keep Frank's wheelchair steady. His usually perfect uniform was now completely disheveled. Water streamed from his cap, and his white gloves were stained with mud from the cemetery grounds. When they reached the tomb, Michael helped Frank position his wheelchair in the proper place for laying the wreath. Despite the storm raging around them, both men fell silent, overwhelmed by the solemnity of the moment. Frank clutched the wreath against his chest, his eyes closed as if communing with spirits only he could see. "Take your time, sir," Michael said quietly, standing at attention behind the wheelchair despite the chaos of the storm around them. Frank began to speak, his voice barely audible over the wind and rain. "Tommy Rodriguez, 19 years old. From Phoenix, Billy Chen, 22, from San Francisco. Marcus Johnson, ... 18, from Detroit." He continued reciting names, a litany of fallen brothers that he had carried in his heart for 5 decades. Michael stood perfectly still, his hand resting protectively on Frank's shoulder as the veteran honored his dead. Rain continued to pour down on both of them, but neither man seemed to notice anymore. They were connected by something deeper than weather, deeper than regulations: the sacred bond between warriors and their commitment to never forget those who made the ultimate sacrifice. The wreath-laying ceremony that should have taken 5 minutes stretched to nearly 20 as Frank continued to speak the names of fallen comrades. Michael never moved, never hurried him, never showed any sign of impatience. Other guards might have been watching from the windows of nearby buildings. Superior officers might have been documenting this unprecedented break in protocol. But Michael's focus remained entirely on helping Frank complete his sacred mission. With great effort and infinite care, Frank leaned forward and placed the wreath at the base of the tomb. His hands lingered on the flowers for a long moment, and Michael could see his shoulders shaking with emotion that had nothing to do with the cold rain. After Frank placed the wreath, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered for generations. Despite the raging storm, Frank slowly began to rise from his wheelchair. His son moved forward to help, but Frank waved him away. Using his walking stick for support, the elderly veteran struggled to his feet, his body shaking from both the cold rain and the enormous effort required. Michael watched in amazement as Frank, now standing on unsteady legs, slowly raised his right hand in a crisp military salute toward the tomb. The rain continued to pour down on both men, but Frank held his salute with the precision and pride of a Marine who had never forgotten his training. His back straightened, despite his age and infirmity, and for a moment Michael could see the young soldier Frank had been 50 years ago without thinking. Michael stepped forward and joined Frank in saluting the tomb. Side by side, the young Army Guard and the elderly Marine veteran stood in perfect silence. Their salutes held steady, despite the storm raging around them. Lightning flashed overhead, thunder rolled across the cemetery, and rain soaked them both completely, but neither man moved. The moment stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Frank's family watched from nearby, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed something they had never expected to see. Frank had not been able to stand without assistance for months, and they had worried that this trip might be too much for him. But here he was, standing tall and proud, honoring his fallen brothers with the dignity they deserved. Michael felt something shift inside him during those moments of shared salute. All his training had focused on precision, discipline, and following protocols to the letter. But standing beside Frank in the rain, he realized that the true purpose of his service went beyond perfect movements and flawless uniforms. He was there to honor the dead and serve the living, especially those who had already given so much for their country. When Frank finally lowered his salute, he turned to Michael with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Thank you for helping an old soldier keep his promise." Michael helped Frank back into his wheelchair, then carefully pushed him toward the shelter where his family was waiting. The storm continued to rage, but Michael moved slowly and steadily, ensuring that Frank remained as comfortable as possible despite the conditions. Other visitors who had witnessed the ceremony began to applaud, their clapping barely audible over the thunder but clearly visible as they showed their appreciation for both men as they reached the covered area. Frank's son approached Michael with obvious gratitude. "Sergeant, I cannot thank you enough for what you did. My father has been planning this trip for 2 years, and it meant everything to him to lay that wreath today." "We were about to give up because of the storm." Michael nodded respectfully. "Your father is a hero, sir. It was my honor to help him complete his mission." Frank's daughter-in-law had brought dry blankets and towels. She immediately began helping Frank out of his soaked clothing. Michael realized he should return to his post, despite being completely drenched and probably facing serious consequences for his unprecedented break in protocol. But as Michael started to walk back toward the tomb, Frank called out to him, "Sergeant." "What is your name?" "Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, sir." "Damn." Frank's eyes widened with emotion. "Rodriguez? I had a friend named Rodriguez in Vietnam. Tommy Rodriguez from Phoenix. Good soldier, good man. Saved my life twice before." Frank's voice trailed off, but Michael understood. The connection was profound and unexpected. Michael's grandfather had indeed served in Vietnam, though they had never talked much about his experiences. Looking at Frank, Michael wondered if there might be some deeper connection between these two men who had served their country. In different wars, but with the same dedication and courage, Frank reached out with a trembling hand and grasped Michael's wet glove. "You remind me of him, son. The same kindness, the same courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Tommy would have done exactly what you did today." Michael felt a lump forming in his throat as he realized the significance of this moment. He was not just a guard following orders or breaking rules. He was part of an unbroken chain of service members who looked out for each other across generations, wars, and circumstances. As Michael finally returned to his post, he was acutely aware that his actions had been witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom had been recording the events on their phones. Videos of the tomb guard helping the veteran in the rain would soon be spreading across social media and news outlets around the world. The storm began to subside slightly, but Michael's mind was racing with the implications of what he had done. He had broken one of the most sacred protocols in military service, abandoning his post to help a civilian. There would certainly be an investigation, possibly a court-martial, and definitely the end of his career as a tomb guard. But as he resumed his ceremonial walk, now in a uniform that was muddy and disheveled, Michael felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. He had honored the unknown soldiers, not just by standing watch, but by embodying the values they had died defending: compassion, courage, and the willingness to help others regardless of personal cost. Frank remained under the shelter for another hour, gradually warming up and regaining his strength. He refused his family's suggestions to return to their hotel, insisting on staying to watch Michael complete his shift. Every few minutes, Frank would look toward the tomb and nod approvingly. As Michael continued his precise movements, now with added meaning and purpose, word of Michael's actions spread faster than wildfire across the internet. A visitor named Jennifer Walsh had captured the entire sequence on her smartphone: Frank's struggle in the storm, Michael's decision to break protocol, their shared salute at the tomb and the gentle way Michael had cared for the elderly veteran. She posted the video on social media with the caption, "This is what honor looks like. A tomb guard risking his career to help a Vietnam veteran honor his fallen brothers." Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and it quickly became international news. Comments poured in from around the world, with viewers praising both Michael's compassion and Frank's dedication. Veterans organizations shared the video widely, calling it a perfect example of the brotherhood that exists among all who have served in uniform. But Michael knew nothing about his newfound fame as he completed his shift that afternoon. He was focused entirely on his duties and the growing certainty that serious consequences awaited him. When his replacement arrived at 3 p.m., Michael was immediately escorted to meet with his commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Stevens. Colonel Stevens was a respected career officer with 25 years of service and a reputation for being both fair and strict. She had overseen the Tomb Guard unit for 3 years and had never faced a situation quite like this one. As Michael entered her office, still in his damp and muddy uniform, she gestured for him to sit down. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she began, her voice calm but serious. "I imagine you know why you are here." "Yes, ma'am. I broke protocol by leaving my post during guard duty. I take full responsibility for my actions and am prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Colonel Stevens studied Michael for a long moment. "Tell me exactly what happened out there, Sergeant." "I want to hear your perspective." Michael recounted the events in detail, explaining his observations of Frank's condition and his growing concern for the veteran's safety. He spoke about the moment when he realized that Frank was not just another tourist, but a combat veteran on a deeply personal mission to honor his fallen comrades. "I knew I was breaking protocol, ma'am," Michael concluded. "I also knew that leaving a fellow veteran in danger was wrong. I made a choice to prioritize his safety over regulations, and I accept full responsibility for that decision." Colonel Stevens nodded thoughtfully. "Sergeant, are you aware that your actions this afternoon have been viewed by millions of people around the world?" Michael's eyes widened in surprise. "No, ma'am. I was not aware of that." The colonel turned her computer screen toward Michael, showing him the viral video and thousands of supportive comments. Messages from veterans, active duty service members, and civilians all praised his actions. Military leaders from other branches of service had publicly supported his decision. Even international military organizations had shared the story as an example of values-based leadership. "The Pentagon has been fielding calls all afternoon," Colonel Stevens continued. "News organizations want interviews. Veterans groups want to honor you, and social media is calling you a hero. But more importantly, the leadership of Arlington National Cemetery and the Army have been discussing your actions." Michael braced himself for what he expected to be devastating news about his military career. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what you did today was technically a violation of standing orders. However, it was also exactly what every American would hope our service members would do when faced with a choice between rules and compassion. You embodied the very values that the unknown soldiers died defending." Michael felt confused by the colonel's tone, which seemed more proud than angry. Colonel Stevens continued. "After extensive discussion with leadership at every level, the decision has been made that no disciplinary action will be taken against you. In fact, you are being commended for exceptional service and for demonstrating the highest values of the United States Army." The relief Michael felt was overwhelming, but Colonel Stevens was not finished. "Furthermore, your actions today have prompted a review of our protocols. While we will never compromise the security and dignity of the tomb, we are developing new guidelines that will allow guards to provide emergency assistance when civilian safety is at genuine risk. You have helped us evolve our service while maintaining our core mission." That evening, Michael received a phone call that surprised him even more than his meeting with Colonel Stevens. Frank Martinez was calling from his hotel room, having obtained Michael's contact information through his family's connections with veteran organizations. "Sergeant Rodriguez." Frank's voice was stronger now, warmed by hot soup and dry clothes. "I wanted to call and thank you properly for what you did today. But more than that, I wanted to tell you something important. Frank went on to explain that he had indeed served with a soldier named Rodriguez in Vietnam, Michael's grandfather, Sergeant First Class Antonio Rodriguez. They had been in the same platoon during some of the heaviest fighting of the war. Frank had been wounded during a firefight, and it was Antonio who had carried him to safety, saving his life. "Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "And today, his grandson showed me that same courage and kindness." Antonio died 2 weeks before the end of his tour, stepping on a landmine while leading a patrol to rescue trapped civilians. "I have carried guilt about his death for 50 years, wondering why I survived when better men like him did not." Michael listened in stunned silence, learning details about his grandfather's service that his family had never known. "When I saw you today, when you chose to help me despite the rules, I finally understood something," Frank continued. "Grandfather did not die so that I could spend 50 years feeling guilty. Yet he died so that people like you could continue his legacy of service and compassion. Today, you showed me that his sacrifice meant something, that the values he died for are still alive in the next generation." The weeks following the storm brought changes that neither Michael nor Frank could have anticipated. The video of their encounter had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, becoming one of the most shared military-related stories in social media history. News organizations from around the world requested interviews, and both men found themselves at the center of a global conversation about duty, compassion, and what it means to truly serve others. Michael initially declined most interview requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But when he learned that veterans organizations wanted to use his story to promote better support for aging veterans, he agreed to participate in a few carefully selected interviews. His message was always the same. He had simply done what any decent person would do when they saw someone in need. Frank, meanwhile, experienced a transformation that amazed his family. The guilt and trauma that had haunted him for 50 years began to lift as he found new purpose in sharing his story. He began speaking at veterans events, telling audiences about the importance of seeking help for invisible wounds and the power of connection between service members across generations. The Army decided to honor both men at a special ceremony held at Arlington National Cemetery 1 month after the storm. The event was attended by hundreds of veterans, active duty service members, and their families. Frank was presented with a certificate of appreciation for his decades of quiet service to his community.
Ow!
While Michael received a commendation for exceptional devotion to duty and embodying the highest values of military service. During the ceremony, Frank met Michael's parents, who had flown in from Texas for the occasion. When Frank told them stories about serving with Michael's grandfather, Antonio, there was not a dry eye in the audience. Michael's mother wept as she learned details about her father's heroism that had been lost to history until this moment. "Son has his grandfather's heart," Frank told Michael's parents. "Antonio saved my life in Vietnam, and 50 years later, his grandson saved my soul by helping me complete a promise I made to fallen comrades." The Rodriguez family legacy of service and compassion continues. The ceremony also featured the announcement of new protocols for tomb guards developed in response to Michael's actions. The Guardian Protocol would allow tomb guards to provide emergency assistance to visitors while maintaining the security and dignity of the site. It was a carefully balanced approach that honored both tradition and humanitarian values. Michael was selected to help train future guards in these new protocols. Sharing the lessons he had learned about balancing duty with compassion, he emphasized that following rules was important, but understanding the purpose behind those rules was even more crucial. The unknown soldiers had died defending values like courage, sacrifice, and caring for others, and sometimes honoring those values meant making difficult decisions. Frank became a regular visitor to Arlington, returning every few months to attend ceremonies and meet with other veterans. He and Michael developed a close friendship that bridged their age difference and different service experiences. Frank would tell Michael stories about the war, helping him understand the weight of history that the tomb represented, while Michael would update Frank on changes and improvements being made to veteran services. The The story inspired countless acts of kindness around the world. Social media was flooded with videos of people helping elderly individuals, service members going out of their way to assist veterans, and ordinary citizens choosing compassion over convenience. Schools began using the story in character education, programs teaching students about moral courage and the importance of helping others even when it might be difficult or costly. 1 year later, Frank returned to Arlington for the anniversary of his wreath-laying ceremony. This time the weather was perfect: clear skies, gentle breeze, and warm sunshine. He was stronger now, both physically and emotionally. Having found peace with his wartime experiences through therapy and the support of the veteran community that had embraced him after his story became known, Michael was there to greet him. Now wearing the stripes of a staff sergeant after his promotion, they walked together to the tomb, where Frank laid another wreath, this one bearing the names of Michael's grandfather and all the other Rodriguez family members who had served in uniform. As they stood together in the sunshine, both men reflected on how a single decision made during a rainstorm had changed both their lives forever. The tomb guard protocols had been updated. Veteran support services had received increased funding and attention, and most importantly, two men from different generations had found healing and purpose through their connection. Frank had discovered that his survival was not a source of guilt, but an opportunity to honor the dead by helping the living. Michael had learned that true military bearing sometimes meant having the courage to break formation when human need called for it. As Michael resumed his ceremonial walk that day, his movements carried new meaning. Each step honored not just the unknown soldiers beneath the marble, but all the Frank Martinezes of the world. Veterans who had served with courage and continued to carry their brothers' memories long after the guns fell silent. The tomb guard's vigil continued as it had for decades, but now it carried an expanded understanding of what it meant to serve with both precision and heart. The rain that had fallen that October day had washed away more than just dust from the cemetery pathways. It had washed away rigid thinking about duty and revealed the deeper truth that the best service always combines discipline with compassion, protocol with humanity, and strength with gentleness. Frank and Michael had shown the world that sometimes the most important protocol is the unwritten one that calls us to care for each other, especially those who have already given so much in service to others.